The boat that shouldn't have been there. There are places in this world where civilization ends and something older begins. The open ocean is one of them. No streetlights, no neighbors, no 911. Just black water stretching endlessly in every direction. And whatever is out there, moving silently through the dark. I didn't fully understand that until one Friday night, about 40 nautical miles off the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, sitting in a rocking boat with my cousin, listening to something that had absolutely no business being there. Let me back up. When my father passed away 3 years ago, he left me two things that mattered: a stubborn streak in his fishing boat, a Robalo 246. Commander with a cabin big enough to sleep two grown men, a small cooler, and enough memories baked into the fiberglass to make selling it feel like a betrayal. The cabin was compact but functional. A fold-out bench that converted into a cot, a built-in storage compartment beneath the helm, a single porthole window that looked out at whatever the sea decided to show you. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. And now it was mine. My dad loved deep-sea fishing more than almost anything else in his life. He used to say the ocean was the last honest place on earth. It didn't pretend to be safe, and it didn't lie about what it was. I never really understood what he meant until that night. My cousin, Danny Hargrove, had been begging me for months to take him out overnight. Danny was the kind of guy who was fearless in the way that people are when they've never actually been tested. Loud, funny, always the first one to say, "That's not scary," about something he hadn't yet experienced. I figured a night out on the Gulf would either make him a fisherman or cure him of the idea forever. Either outcome seemed fine to me. We left the marina in Biloxi just after noon on a Friday. The Gulf was calm, the sky was clear, and the forecast promised it would stay that way through the entire weekend. I steered us about an hour out from shore, well past the shallower coastal waters and the weekend recreational boaters, until we hit the kind of deep blue that means you're genuinely out there. The water changes color at a certain depth, goes from the murky green-brown of the shallows to a blue so dark and saturated it looks almost artificial. I cut the engine and dropped anchor when we reached it. We had two fishing rods rigged and ready, a portable Bluetooth speaker, a cooler packed with sandwiches and enough canned beer to last through the weekend, and absolutely zero concerns. The afternoon passed the way good afternoons should, slowly with sunburned shoulders and the occasional satisfying pull on the line. Danny caught a decent-sized red snapper in the late afternoon and celebrated with the energy of a man who had just won the Super Bowl. I let him have the moment. He'd earned it. It was a genuinely good day. The sunset out there, 40 miles from shore with nothing between you and the horizon in any direction, is something I wish I could hand directly to someone. The water turned the color of hammered copper. The sky went from orange to a deep arterial red at the edges, and the clouds caught fire in shades I've never been able to accurately describe to anyone who wasn't there. My father was right about at least one thing. The ocean is honest. And honestly, in that moment, it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen in my life. That beauty was the last peaceful thing that happened that entire night. By the time the sky went fully dark, and I mean fully dark, no moon, no ambient light from shore, just stars and blackness, Danny and I had retreated into the cabin. We'd packed up our gear, eaten our sandwiches, and opened fresh beers. Danny was shuffling a deck of cards when he stopped mid-shuffle and told me to stop talking. I hadn't been saying anything, but I went quiet anyway. I remember the exact look on his face. Danny was never quiet. Danny was never serious, but right then he was both of those things. And that alone was enough to make my stomach drop several inches. Do you hear that? he said quietly. I listened. Out past the gentle, rhythmic slap of water against the hull, there was an engine, distant but real and unmistakable. A boat motor running slow. The kind of sound that in daylight would mean absolutely nothing. Fishermen heading home, weekend boaters, a shrimp trawler working the Outer Banks. But it was past 10 at night, 40 miles from the nearest shore, and there were no lights visible anywhere on the water. We went outside together and stood on the deck, staring into the surrounding darkness. Without a moon, visibility extended maybe 60 feet in any direction before the darkness became absolute. Beyond that was nothing but formless black and the occasional white shimmer of a breaking wave. The motor circled us. That's the only accurate description. It didn't pass through our position heading somewhere else. It didn't approach and then recede. It moved around us, slow, deliberate, measured, like something in the process of making a decision. Our cabin lights were fully on. Any vessel within a quarter mile could see us clearly and easily. Whoever was out there knew exactly where we were anchored. Then the motor cut off. No gradual reduction in throttle, no idle, no winding down. The engine stopped mid-note, instantly and completely, and the only sound remaining was the water. Danny looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. "They're watching us," he said. I told him he was being paranoid, but I started the engine anyway, and I steered us away from the spot, maybe 5 minutes in the direction opposite to where we'd last heard the other boat. I told Danny it was just some fishermen anchoring for the night in the area. I told myself the same thing, with about the same level of conviction. By the time I cut our engine again and we went back inside the cabin, the silence felt complete, and I'd mostly convinced myself that everything was fine and we were overthinking a normal maritime situation. We lasted about 4 minutes before we heard it again. This time the engine was quieter than before, closer. It wasn't approaching the way a passing vessel would sound. It was creeping toward us, throttle barely open, moving through the water at just above idle speed, like whoever had their hand on the controls was actively trying not to be heard. The sound was coming from the right side of the boat, which was the direction we hadn't come from. Danny and I looked at each other across the narrow card table. Neither of us said anything. There was nothing useful to say. We went outside again. The moment our feet hit the deck, the engine cut for the second time. The silence that followed was different from the first silence, heavier, deliberate. "Turn on the spotlight," Danny said. His voice was flat, not frightened exactly, but emptied of the usual warmth. The kind of voice people use when they've already processed what they're afraid of and come out on the other side into something colder and more focused. The spotlight on the robalo rotated only about 180 degrees. I swung the bow slightly to the right to give us a better arc, then switched the light on. The beam cut out across the water, white and sharp and startlingly bright, a blade of light punching through the dark. I swept it left. Water. Small chop. The gentle rise and fall of empty ocean. I swept it right. More water. More darkness at the edges of the beam. I swept it further right. My heart stopped working for a moment. There was a boat, roughly 80 feet away, maybe less. No running lights, no cabin lights, nothing lit at all. Just sitting on the water in complete darkness, pointed directly at us. The spotlight caught the white of the hull and the dark outline of a cabin structure. And for one frozen second, I could see that it was real, and it was close, and it was facing us like something that had been waiting. I turned the spotlight off immediately. "Cabin lights," I said to Danny. "Turn them off now." I didn't wait. I was already at the helm, pushing the throttle all the way forward. The Robolo's engine roared and the bow lifted, and we were moving, cutting hard through the dark water, and I kept my eyes forward and did not look behind me. I drove for 5 solid minutes at full throttle before I even reduced speed enough to think clearly. We didn't sleep that night. Danny and I stood on the deck in the darkness for a very long time, not talking much, watching the water in every direction. Nothing followed us, or nothing we could detect followed us. When the surrounding silence began to feel like safety instead of a held breath, we eventually went back inside. But neither of us brought up the obvious question. Neither of us had a good answer to why a boat would run completely dark, 40 miles offshore, past 10 at night, and sit motionless in the water pointing at our position. There's no innocent explanation for that sequence of events. There are explanations, but none of them are innocent. At around 3 in the morning, something woke me up. Not the rocking motion of the boat. Not a dream. A sound directly above my head, thumping, slow and evenly spaced, coming from the roof of the cabin, from the forward deck above us. I lay completely still and listened. Thump. A pause of 3 or 4 seconds. Thump. Another pause. I looked over at Danny, asleep on the opposite bench, chest rising and falling. I whispered his name, louder each time, until his eyes opened and found me. I pointed at the ceiling without saying anything. He looked up, looked back at me, and in his face I saw the same thing I was feeling. This is happening, and it is real. I opened the cabin door slowly. The deck was not empty. There were 2 men on my boat. One was standing at the bow, the forward section of the vessel, up past the windshield, with no reasonable explanation for why he was there. The second man was standing on another boat that had been pulled alongside mine, tied directly against our hull, close enough that I hadn't heard it arrive over the sound of my own breathing. Both men had their faces turned toward us, and when Danny came through the door behind me, both men raised their hands slowly, palms outward, in the universal gesture of claimed harmlessness. "Easy," the man on my boat said. "We're not here to cause problems." He was large, easily over 6 feet, broad through the shoulders, wearing dark clothing. His voice was calm and controlled in a way that felt practiced. The man on the other boat hadn't moved and hadn't spoken. He stood very still and watched us. The large man said they had nearly run out of fuel and needed assistance. He said he'd been about to knock on our cabin door to ask for help. He was standing at the bow. The cabin door is at the stern. There is no reason to walk to the front of a stranger's boat in the dark before knocking on their door. None. Unless knocking was not the original plan. He stepped down from the bow toward Danny and me, closing the distance between us, moving into the space where we were standing. Up close, the size differential was significant. He was bigger than both of us combined in any practical sense. He looked at me steadily for a moment, then extended his hand toward me, palm up, expecting a handshake. I don't know where the decision came from. It wasn't rational. There was no thought, no internal calculation. Some older and faster part of me simply acted on information that my conscious mind was still processing. I hit him with both hands, flat against the chest, and shoved with everything I had. He went over the rail and into the water with a sound like a large stone being dropped. I was already running for the helm. I was shouting at Danny to watch the rail, to make sure nobody got back on the boat, to keep watching. I got the engine going and pushed the throttle all the way forward in a single motion. The Robolo jumped and we were cutting water before the man behind us had even surfaced. I didn't look back. I drove for 2 full hours at a speed that was too fast for safety in the dark, watching the water ahead and trusting that whatever was behind us would fall away into the distance. When the lights of Biloxi eventually appeared on the horizon, I felt something in my chest release that had been locked shut since the spotlight showed me that dark hull floating 80 feet away. We tied up at my slip in the marina. I sat down on the deck and my hands were shaking too badly to hold my phone. We slept on the boat that night, not because the boat was comfortable, because neither of us could drive a car. I still don't know who those men were. I know that they weren't fishermen asking for fuel. Nobody runs dark for 40 miles, circles a vessel for 20 minutes in the middle of the night, cuts their engine twice, and appears silently alongside a sleeping boat at 3 in the morning because they ran low on gas. That sequence of events has no innocent reading. The ocean doesn't pretend to be safe. My father was right about that, and I understand it now in a way I didn't before. The hallway at the end of the ship. Some fears are immediate. The sudden sound of an engine in the surrounding darkness. A stranger's hand extending towards you in the middle of the night. Those fears are sharp and physical, hardwired into the most ancient architecture of the brain, designed to trigger a response before thought catches up. But some fears grow slowly. They build over hours, fed by small wrong details accumulating one by one. A hallway that shouldn't exist in the section of the ship you're walking through. A figure standing in the dark where no figure should be standing. And a night that slowly collapses the boundary between what's happening and what you're dreaming until you genuinely cannot be certain anymore what you actually saw. What happened to me on a Norwegian cruise 4 years ago was the second kind of fear. And in several ways, it was the kind that stays with you longest. It started as a completely ordinary vacation. 4 friends, 7 nights aboard the Norwegian Escape. Departing from Miami and sailing through the Eastern Caribbean. We were all in our early 30s, working desk jobs that had gradually absorbed our personalities. And this trip was supposed to be an antidote to all of that, a full reset. No laptops, no alarm clocks, no checking work email at 11 at night. Just warm water and unlimited food, and enough rounds at the poolside bar to temporarily forget what day of the week it was. The first 2 days were exactly what we'd paid for. We ate too much at every meal, slept past 9, sat in deck chairs watching the ocean, struck up conversations with strangers at the bar that felt meaningful in the way vacation conversations do. My friend Marcus, who had never been on a cruise before, declared it the single greatest human invention in the history of civilization. I was inclined to agree with him. Then the sushi started catching up with me. I had, without fully realizing it, eaten raw fish at nearly every meal since boarding. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, midnight buffet. My body had opinions about this that it had been patiently developing over 48 hours. And by the afternoon of the 3rd day, it began presenting those opinions in the form of dizziness, a persistent low-grade nausea, and a pressure behind my eyes that made the ship's ambient noise feel like it was happening slightly too loud and slightly too close. Marcus told me several times to stop eating the sushi. He was clear about this. I acknowledged the advice and continued eating the sushi. By evening, I was genuinely, meaningfully unwell. Our group was sitting in one of the bars on the lower public decks, the kind of venue that feels like someone designed a Vegas lounge and then installed it inside a submarine. The noise, the moving crowd, the flickering neon of the cocktail displays, the constant subtle motion of the ship itself, all of it was combining badly. I told the group I was heading back to my cabin. Marcus offered to walk me back. I told him I was fine and could manage, which was only partially accurate. I took the elevator down and made what I believed was the correct set of turns through the corridor network toward my cabin section. I'd made this walk twice already without incident. The layout of a large cruise ship is straightforward once you've mapped a few reference points. I lost those reference points somewhere in the second corridor. I found myself in a hallway where the floor was tile instead of carpet, an immediate signal that something was wrong, because the entire passenger deck I was on should have been carpeted. The walls were a slightly different shade, more institutional than the warm tones of the public areas. The overhead lights were fluorescent rather than the warm embedded LEDs of the passenger corridors. Employee section. Service corridor. Something that passengers were not supposed to be navigating on their own. Before I could turn back, a young crew member came around the corner ahead of me. A woman in the white hospitality uniform, with a heavy Eastern European accent and an expression that registered mild surprise at seeing a passenger this far back. I apologized for being lost and asked her for the quickest route back to my cabin section. She pointed me forward and said something about a sign and a left turn. I thanked her and kept walking. The corridor stretched longer than I anticipated. The ceiling seemed slightly lower toward the far end. Or maybe that was the headache distorting things. I came to a sign. I have genuinely tried to recall what it said, and I can't. Only that it existed, and that I turned left at it because she had said to turn left at the sign. The hallway I entered should not have been there. Not in the sense of it being structurally impossible. I understand that large ships contain all kinds of service corridors that passengers never see. I mean that it was wrong in the way that a room is sometimes wrong before you can identify why. Something about the proportions. Something about the quality of the air in it. Half the overhead lights were dead. The remaining fixtures cast isolated pools of yellow light onto the tile floor, with genuine darkness between them. One light near the middle section of the hallway was cycling, on, off, on, off, in a slow rhythm that made the shadows shift and reposition every few seconds. The effect was disorienting in a way that my compromised physical state did nothing to help. At the far end of the hallway, in the section beyond the reach of any working light, in genuine darkness rather than dimness, there was a person, standing against the wall, facing it. I stopped walking, completely stopped in the middle of the hallway, and stood there watching the figure. I waited for the rational explanation to surface, a crew member taking a private break somewhere passengers wouldn't bother them, a maintenance worker pausing their work to check something, someone else who'd gotten turned around in the service quarters. The figure did not move. I rubbed my eyes, literally rubbed them, pressing my knuckles against my eyelids like someone trying to clear a screen, because my head was pounding and my stomach was churning, and I was prepared to accept that I was seeing things that weren't fully there. When I lowered my hands, the figure had turned. It was looking at me. I could not see a face. The far end of the hallway was in genuine, comprehensive darkness, and the figure was standing within it. What I could see was orientation, the body now directed toward me, the head positioned toward me, with an attentiveness that felt specific and personal, as though whatever was at the end of that hallway had been waiting for me specifically to appear. I turned around and walked back the way I came. I did not run. I made a point of not running. I walked at the measured, deliberate pace of a person who has reconsidered their route and made a practical decision to return to the elevator. I found the main corridor. I found the elevators. I rode them to my deck and felt the carpet under my feet and nearly crumbled with relief. I got to my cabin. Marcus was already asleep. I took aspirin and drank a full bottle of water and lay down in the dark and told myself that I had been ill and disoriented, and the figure was a crew member taking a break, and the flickering light had made everything look worse than it was. I closed my eyes and went to sleep. I woke at some indeterminate hour in the deep middle of the night to discover that I could not move, not the partial paralysis of deep sleep, not the heaviness of a body that doesn't want to be awake yet. Complete and absolute physical immobility. My eyes were open and functioning. I was fully conscious. I could see the ceiling, the faint light leaking around the edges of the porthole curtain, the dark outlines of the cabin furniture. I could feel the slight motion of the ship. I was entirely, unmistakably awake, and I could not move a single part of my body below my neck. I had encountered the concept of sleep paralysis in an article once, years before, and something about the academic understanding of it came back to me then. The REM atonia mechanism misfiring, consciousness returning before the paralytic state that protects the body during dreaming lifts, a documented neurological event that was temporary and not dangerous, and produced hallucinations so vivid they were indistinguishable from reality. I remembered all of this. It helped me not at all, because there was something in the room. I could see it in the lower left corner of my field of vision, just at the edge of what my immobile eyes could reach. A shape, upright, standing near the wall, standing facing the wall. The same posture as the figure in the hallway. I told myself this was the hallucination. I said it internally, clearly and deliberately. This is sleep paralysis. This is not real. This is a known medical phenomenon. I said it several times with complete conviction. The figure turned around. It moved the way things move in the logic of nightmares, not walking through the intervening space but arriving at a new position without having visibly traveled. It was at the foot of my bed. It was standing over me, looking down. The distance between us was perhaps 4 feet. I could not see it the way you see a person. I could not see clothing or hair or hands. What I registered was an absence, a shape that occupied space where space should not be occupied, that absorbed the available light rather than reflecting it, that had the dimensions and proportions of a person while being nothing, that I would call a person. Where the face should have been, there was darkness shaped like a face. Where the eyes should have been, there were 2 points of concentrated attention that I felt rather than saw. I attempted to scream. The signal traveled from my brain and disappeared before it reached my throat. The figure's head tilted, slow, patient, like something examining a small creature it has encountered before and finds mildly interesting. Its mouth opened, wider than any mouth should open. The jaw descended past all physical possibility, continuing past the point where bone and tissue would have stopped it, opening into an impossibly black space. And from that space came a sound that reached past my ears entirely and landed in the oldest part of my brain, a frequency of pure wrongness, built from the raw material of human screaming, but not human, not anything I had vocabulary for. That sound pulled me out of the paralysis the way a hand yanks someone from water. I screamed. I sat upright. My own voice came back to me through my mouth. At the same moment, the other sound stopped, and the room was just a room. A dark cabin on a ship, porthole curtain moving slightly with the ship's ventilation. Marcus in the other bed, bolting upright and asking what happened. What was wrong? Was I okay? My entire body was shaking. I could feel it in my jaw and my hands and the soles of my feet. I told Marcus everything. The hallway, the figure at the end of it, the paralysis, all of it. He listened with the careful, steady expression of a friend who is making sure he doesn't say the wrong thing to someone who is clearly in a fragile state. Then he said, very gently, "You've eaten nothing but raw tuna for 3 days. Your body is staging a formal protest." He wasn't wrong about the physical dimension of it. The food poisoning, or whatever had happened to my system, had clearly amplified the experience, distorted it, given it an intensity it might not otherwise have had. But I think about the hallway, the figure facing the wall, the way it turned and oriented toward me before I made any sound or movement that should have alerted it. The way that specific posture, that specific stillness, became the template for what I experienced in the paralysis later. I'm 90% certain it was the sickness feeding my sleeping brain. That remaining 10% has never quieted down. It doesn't need much space to be loud. The man under the bed. The ocean promises you solitude. That's the implicit contract of going far enough offshore. You are genuinely removed from other people, from foot traffic and strangers and the unpredictability of proximity to other human beings. Nobody can open a door and walk in unannounced when you're 12 miles from the nearest coast. That's the promise. I believed it without examination because I had always believed it, because nothing had ever suggested otherwise. I was wrong in a way that I still have difficulty fully processing. 3 years ago, my wife Claire and I bought a waterfront house in Clearwater, Florida. We'd been living in Savannah, Georgia for 8 years, and the decision to move had been slow and careful and was finally done. We had our son Cooper, who was 12, a retriever named Hank who was emotionally unprepared for most things, and a 22-foot Grady White fishing boat that had accumulated 4 years of good memories during our Georgia time. The boat presented a logistical challenge. We had no vehicle rated to tow it, and no trailer for it, and renting both seemed expensive and complicated. The practical solution, the one Claire raised several times with the patient, knowing tone of someone who already knows the other person's answer, was to simply sell the boat in Georgia and buy something new once we were settled in Florida. But I'd caught my first tarpon on that boat. Cooper had caught his first fish on that boat. There was a summer photograph of a redfish I'd finally landed after 3 straight weekends of failing, and that photograph was my phone wallpaper, and there was no version of events in which I sold the boat. So I made the decision that was obviously going to produce a story. I would sail it down the Atlantic coast, around the Florida Keys, up into the Gulf. Claire thought I was treating a logistical problem as an adventure, which was accurate. She kissed me goodbye and Cooper waved from the end of the dock, and Hank barked twice in a register that sounded almost like a warning. Day 1 was good sailing. Fair weather, manageable swells, good pace. I anchored overnight in a protected cove just over the Georgia-Florida border, slept reasonably well, and woke up optimistic about the whole enterprise. Day 2 was a long haul, 12 hours on the water with short breaks. By the time I dropped anchor somewhere south of Jacksonville as the light faded, I was tired in the specific way that sustained solo sailing produces, not physically broken, but scraped hollow, worn thin by hours of uninterrupted open water in every direction. Sleeping on an anchored boat in open water requires practice I didn't quite have yet. The vessel moves constantly, not in swells but in the small persistent rocking generated by the current passing beneath the hull. The mattress in the Grady White's cabin was fine, and the sleeping bag was warm, but the motion meant I spent the first hour rolling from position to position in a fruitless search for the arrangement that would bother me least. I was somewhere in the 4th or 5th iteration of this when the sounds from above started. Footsteps, not a single creak from hull expansion, not the random settling noise a boat makes as temperature changes. Footsteps, the sequential, evenly spaced impact of weight meeting a surface, moving from one position to the next, walking across the forward section of the deck directly above the cabin. I went completely still and listened. The pattern repeated, slow, deliberate, moving from the forward area toward the midship section, covering real distance with each contact. Someone was walking on my boat. I ran through explanations. debris landing from above, a large seabird, the way sound propagated in unusual ways across still water at night. Boats produced constant noise, mechanical systems, hull movement, the play of lines against cleats, and alone in the dark with no other noise to compete, any of those sounds could be misread. These were good explanations. I tested them internally until I almost believed them. Then something heavy entered the water beside the boat. One clean, close splash, the sound of deliberate departure, of something that had been on the deck choosing to leave it. The silence afterward was absolute and specific, the kind of silence that has shape. I was in the cockpit and had the engine running before I had consciously decided to move. I gave the boat full throttle without turning on any lights and steered away from the position at speed, watching nothing behind me, not looking at anything in the water around me, simply moving away from that spot as fast as the Grady White would go. I drove until the adrenaline started to thin, maybe 30 minutes. When my hands steadied enough to think clearly, I cut the engine, dropped anchor, and sat in the dark for a while. Then I went back to the cabin and lay down. Sleep came close, and then retreated, and I lay in that frustrating border territory for what I estimated was 40 minutes before the sounds returned. Louder this time, unambiguous. The rhythm was precise and human. I had spent enough time on enough boats to know the difference between mechanical noise and footsteps on fiberglass. Someone was on my boat again. Someone who had apparently located me across 30 minutes of night sailing and open water. I got up and went through the entire boat, every section of the deck, bow to stern. I looked at everything in the range of my flashlight. The boat was empty. I stood there in the night air trying to reconcile what I'd heard with what I could see. Nothing in either direction. No other vessels visible. The water black and flat and offering nothing. I went back inside. I made myself be absolutely still. I controlled my breathing, slowed it down, and in that stillness I began to register something that I had been too frightened and too loud internally to hear before. There was breathing in the cabin. It was slow, slightly heavier than my own, rhythmic in the particular way that the body breathes when it's trying to be quiet, rather than sleeping naturally. It was not coming from any direction consistent with the furniture or the storage compartments. It was coming from below me, from beneath the bed. I got up. I walked to the cockpit. I locked the door from inside. I sat at the helm and held very still, and I did not look at the cabin for as long as I could manage it. Then I turned to check the small porthole window that looked through from the cabin into the cockpit. I turned back to the water. I kept a steady heading in the direction of the nearest shoreline. I checked the window every 4 to 5 minutes, and for the first several checks it showed me nothing but the dark interior of the cabin and the curtain hanging still. On the 7th check, the curtain was moved, just the lower corner displaced slightly, and in the gap between fabric and glass, an eye. The outer quarter of a face, looking into the cockpit at me. I looked away immediately, forcing my eyes back to the water ahead, acting with everything I had, like I hadn't seen anything. My hands were shaking on the wheel badly enough that maintaining a straight heading required active effort. I called 911 and was routed to the Coast Guard, and then to the local Marine Police, and then to a county sheriff's deputy who took my location and heading and told me officers would be waiting at a public dock I could reach within a few hours. He told me to stay in the cockpit, keep moving, and do not engage with whoever was on the boat. 3.5 hours. That was how long I drove in the dark, alone in the cockpit with someone watching me through a curtain gap from 8 feet away, with the lights of shore slowly growing from suggestion to reality. When the dock lights finally resolved into shapes I could navigate toward, I saw the police cruisers in the parking lot, and I felt something release in my chest that I hadn't known was clenched. I tied off, stepped onto the dock, and pointed at the cabin. The two officers went in with their hands on their holsters. 11 seconds later, I heard shouting. They walked him out. He was somewhere between 50 and 60. Long gray hair, wet and matted against his face and neck. Similar beard, wet. Ripped jeans, gray t-shirt, both soaked through. He looked like he had been in the ocean at some point before boarding my boat. He looked like he hadn't slept or eaten in several days. They walked him past me toward the cruiser, and he turned his head and looked at me, and he laughed. It was the most disturbing sound I've encountered in a life that now includes a fair number of disturbing sounds. Not the laughter of someone who finds something funny. A hollow, disconnected sound, like laughter occurring in the body of someone who was not entirely present in it. It ran too long, didn't peak or drop the way actual laughter does. And then it stopped the moment the car door closed behind him. The police questioned him for hours. He answered none of their questions. When he finally was charged with what could be charged, he had provided no account of how he'd gotten onto the boat, or when, or from where, or what his intentions had been. The officers told me later that based on his condition, the wetness, the state of his clothes, their best theory was that he'd been in the water near one of my anchoring positions and climbed aboard while I was below decks, before I even started that segment of the journey, before I was asleep. He had been under my bed the entire time. I think about the breathing, slow and careful, controlled, coming from that narrow, dark space while I lay directly above him. I think about the hours he spent there while I drove through the night. I think about what he was waiting for, and why he stayed hidden as long as he did, and what the plan was before I got to shore faster than he'd expected. Those thoughts are the ones that don't diminish with time. The next morning, I made it to Clearwater. Claire was at the dock. Cooper was with her. Even Hank seemed relieved, pressing himself against my legs like an anchor. I told them it had been a long trip. It took me a week to tell them the rest. What the dark water holds. There's a version of these stories where the takeaway is clean and practical. Check under the bed before you cast off. Don't stay put when something is circling you in the dark. Trust your body's response to a hallway that feels wrong, even when your brain is generating rationalizations. That's part of it, but it's not the whole of it. The real lesson, the one that took me years to put into words, is about the nature of the systems we rely on to feel safe. We build these systems carefully and we live inside them so thoroughly that we begin to mistake them for reality rather than structure. Locks and laws and the statistical probability that the strangers around us mean no harm. Cell coverage and marine radio, and the Coast Guard response time. The reassuring architecture of a world designed to be navigable. The ocean exists completely outside those systems. It always has. And the ocean is not unusual in this. There are other places and other situations where the architecture falls away, and you're left with something that precedes it. The ocean is simply the most honest about it. I've spent most of my life on the water. The 3 experiences I've described, the dark boat in the Gulf, the hallway on the cruise ship, the man breathing under my bed, didn't take me away from the water. They changed my relationship to it into something more accurate, something that sees it the way my father did. But there are other stories from people who work the water professionally, commercial fishermen, Coast Guard crews, maritime researchers, people who have logged thousands of hours on the ocean across decades, People who have encountered things that have no clean explanation, things that didn't resolve into rationality on later reflection, things that live in the mind the way certain experiences do, permanently, quietly, and with no intention of leaving. I met a man named Ray Dutton at a marina outside Fort Lauderdale about 2 years ago. Ray was a commercial fisherman for 22 years before a knee injury ended his time on working boats. He was in his mid-60s, built like someone who had spent decades doing physical work, and he communicated skepticism through silence. When he didn't believe something you'd said, he simply didn't respond to it and waited for you to run out of words. When he spoke, it was because he had made a decision to speak, and what came out was what he actually thought. He told me about a night roughly 15 years earlier when he was aboard a commercial trawler about 70 miles east of Fort Lauderdale, heading back toward port with a full catch. 2 in the morning, calm water, excellent visibility. He was on watch, the rest of the crew asleep. The VHF radio began receiving a voice, not a distress call, not standard vessel traffic, not the Coast Guard making a routine weather broadcast. A single voice speaking slowly and evenly in what sounded like English arranged in a pattern Ray could not parse into meaning, like someone reciting something memorized, like a recording played at slightly the wrong speed. The words were there, but the information they were supposed to convey kept sliding away before it could be grasped. The transmission carried no vessel identifier, no coordinates, no protocol markers of any kind. Ray keyed the mic and responded. Nothing came back. He switched to adjacent channels, verified his equipment, confirmed everything was functioning normally. He returned to the channel where he'd heard the voice. It was still transmitting. He listened to it for 11 minutes. He timed it because he logged everything, because that was what a careful man on a working boat did. At the end of the 11th minute, the voice stopped, not interrupted, concluded. As if whatever it had been communicating had reached its end and there was simply nothing left to say. Ray checked with the Coast Guard in the morning. No record of any transmission on that frequency during that time frame existed. No other vessel in the area had reported a radio anomaly of any kind. The incident was, in every official sense, unverifiable and unexplained. He told me this story the way he told all his stories, flatly, without drama, without visible expectation of any particular reaction from me. When he finished, he looked at me and said, "I'm not making a claim about what it was. I'm telling you it happened. I have no reason to doubt him." A few months later, I spoke with a woman named Patricia Chen, who had served 8 years as a rescue swimmer for the Coast Guard out of Key West. She had the resume that produces immediate credibility, hundreds of open water rescues, sustained performance under the kind of physical and psychological demands that most people would not survive for a month, let alone 8 years. She was not a person who frightened easily, and she was not a person who exaggerated. She described a rescue response from about 40 miles south of Key West, 3 years into her service. A pleasure craft had radioed in with mechanical failure and deteriorating conditions, a common enough call. The helicopter reached the vessel and found conditions difficult but workable. Patricia went into the water and boarded the boat. It was a 30-foot sloop, sails down, engine dead, taking on minor water but in no immediate danger of going under. 3 people on the deck, a couple, both in their late 50s, and their adult daughter in her 20s. All 3 were on deck when Patricia arrived. All 3 were looking in the same direction, southeast, away from the coast, away from the helicopter. Patricia asked if they were okay. The husband said yes, absolutely, thank you. The wife did not respond. The daughter did not respond. They both continued looking southeast. Patricia initiated the evacuation protocol, asking them to prepare for transfer to the helicopter. The husband said, of course, right away, happy to. He moved toward her immediately. The two women did not move. Patricia put a hand on the wife's arm and spoke to her directly. The woman turned and looked at Patricia with an expression Patricia described carefully as recognition. The specific look you give to someone you know unexpectedly encountered. As though Patricia were a familiar face, expected to appear. "It's gone now," the wife said. Patricia asked what was gone. The woman looked back toward the southeast and said, "Whatever was out there." That was the only thing she said about it. The daughter spoke no words during the entire evacuation. The husband was cooperative and pleasant, and when Patricia asked him in the helicopter what the two women had been watching, he said he genuinely did not know. He said they had been staring in that direction for approximately 40 minutes before the Coast Guard arrived, and he had tried repeatedly to get their attention without success. The only thing that had broken whatever held them, he said, was the physical contact of Patricia's hand on his wife's arm. All three were medically evaluated once they were ashore. No physical injuries, no signs of toxic exposure or physiological distress. The two women, when interviewed separately, confirmed they had seen something in the water. Something large. Something that moved slowly. Neither would describe size or shape or color in any specificity. Both used the same phrasing unprompted, without having spoken to each other between the interviews. It didn't look like it belonged here. Patricia had, in 8 years, interviewed several hundred people in maritime distress. She had extensive experience with shock, with trauma, with the way the mind processes sudden fear. She told me the two women on that sloop were the only people she had ever been unable to categorize. People in shock behave in consistent and recognizable ways, she said. Those two weren't in shock. They were watching something, and they watched it until it was gone. And then they were fine. She paused. That's what stays with me. That they were fine. That whatever they saw, they weren't afraid of it. They were just watching. 6 months after the coastal voyage, after the gray-haired man and the breathing under the bed and the hollow laugh fading into a police cruiser, I went back out on the water. A Sunday afternoon, clear sky, light swells, just me and the Grady White in the Gulf of Mexico. I needed to find out whether I still could. I anchored 8 miles out and fished through the afternoon without incident. It was good in the uncomplicated way that being on the water can be good when nothing is wrong. Slow and warm and occasionally punctuated by something worth paying attention to on the line. By late afternoon, I had a decent catch and a sunburn I'd regret, and the particular peace that comes from hours of doing one simple thing well. I was gathering my gear as the light began to shift when I looked over the side of the boat and saw something in the water below me. The Gulf was clear enough in the fading afternoon light to see down perhaps 12 or 15 feet, and at the edge of that visibility, moving slowly along the bottom and then beyond it into the depth where the light gave out, there was a shape, large, pale, moving with the deliberate, unhurried quality of something that had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. I watched it for perhaps 30 seconds before the angle of the light changed and the surface reflections closed off my view of the depth, and it was simply gone. I've considered what it was. Large rays can reach impressive size in those waters, and the Gulf holds species that surface rarely and are poorly documented. There are rational explanations, and I don't dismiss them. But what I actually remember from that moment is not what I saw. It's what I felt. Not fear. Or not only fear. Something that combined fear with the particular awe you experience at the edge of something genuinely larger than you. Standing at the rim of the Grand Canyon, looking up at a clear sky far from any city, standing on a beach while a storm approaches over open water. The awe of scale, the awe of realizing that the world is larger and older and less completely understood than the routine business of daily life suggests. The ocean doesn't owe us comprehension. It has never owed us safety, and it has never guaranteed explanations for what happens in its darkness or its depth. It was here before we were, and it will be hereafter, and the things that live in it and move through it have no obligation to be knowable to us. My father called it the last honest place. He said that like it was a compliment, and it is a compliment, but honesty isn't always comfortable. Sometimes the most honest answer is the one that doesn't resolve, the dark shape moving into deeper water, the voice on a dead channel speaking words in an order that won't parse, two women on a damaged sloop watching something in the southeast with an attention that was not fear. We build stories about the ocean. We always have. Sea monsters and sirens and the ghost ships of 100 maritime traditions. We build those stories because the alternative, accepting the incompleteness of what we know, sitting with the open question, is uncomfortable for creatures who evolved to close loops and resolve uncertainty. But the loops don't always close. Some things move off into the deep water and stay there, doing whatever they do in the dark, requiring nothing of us except the honesty to acknowledge that they exist. I sailed back to shore that evening as the first stars appeared over the Gulf. Tied up at my slip, walked to my truck, drove home to my family and my dog, and the dry, reliable solidity of land. Made dinner, watched television, slept in a bed that sat on a solid foundation. But I thought about the shape in the water. I thought about Ray's voice on the silent radio channel. I thought about two women looking southeast at something that didn't look like it belonged here. And I thought about my father, and what he understood about the ocean that I'm only now beginning to learn. The honest answer is that we don't know what's down there. We never will. And out past 40 miles in the dark, with no moon, something knows we're here. Voices from the deep, stories that never left the water. Every coastal town in America has a version of these stories. Ask the right people. The ones who have spent real time on the water, who don't use the word probably as a comfort blanket, who have learned to describe what they saw without editorializing. And you'll find accounts that don't fit neatly into any category. Not ghost stories exactly. Not sea monster legends passed down for atmosphere. Something more specific than that. Something that happened to a specific person on a specific night, at specific coordinates, and that person has been carrying it ever since because there is no satisfying place to put it down. I've collected a few of them over the years. Here are the ones that stayed with me longest. A man I'll call Thomas. He asked me not to use his real name, which tells you something about how seriously he takes what happened. Worked on a commercial crab boat out of Apalachicola, Florida for 11 seasons. He's in his late 40s now, on shore, with a quiet life and a long memory. He told me about a morning in early November about 6 years ago. He and his crew were running traps about 30 miles offshore in the Gulf, 2 hours before dawn. Routine work, haul the trap, sort the catch, rebait, drop it, move to the next marker. He'd done the same, sequence, thousands of times. On the third trap of the morning, something came up with the cage. Not in the cage. Thomas was clear about this. The trap came up clean, normal catch, nothing unusual inside. But wrapped around the exterior of the cage, tangled in the wire frame, was a length of rope. Old rope, the kind that had been in the water for a very long time. Dark with growth. Soft in a way that new rope isn't. Knotted at intervals in a pattern that Thomas, who had been tying maritime knots since he was a teenager, did not recognize. He untangled it and set it aside to look at more carefully in better light. When the light came up and he examined it, he counted 14 knots, each one different. Each one tied with obvious skill by someone who knew what they were doing. None of them matched any knot in Thomas's considerable working knowledge of maritime rope work. He showed it to the two other experienced hands on the boat. Neither recognized the knot patterns. One of them, an older man who had been fishing Gulf waters for 30 years, looked at the rope for a long time without saying anything, then set it carefully on the rail and went back to work. At the end of the day, when they were heading back to port, Thomas went to get the rope to bring it home. It was gone. The rail was empty. No one on the crew admitted to throwing it overboard or moving it. The boat had 4 men on it. It was a clear day with flat water, and the rope had disappeared from a 4-inch wide rail on a vessel where no one had gone near that section of the boat since morning. Thomas told me this story without asking me to believe any particular interpretation of it. He told it the way a careful man describes something real, with attention to what he actually observed, without filling in what he didn't observe, without asking for more credit than the facts could carry. "I've seen a lot of strange things come up in crab traps," he said, "but I'd been doing the work long enough to know that rope was tied by someone who understood the water. Whatever those knots meant, and I think they meant something, I never figured it out. The last account I want to share came to me from a woman named Sandra Weeks, who grew up on the Outer Banks of North Carolina and spent her 20s working on whale watching and deep-sea charter boats, before eventually becoming a marine biology research technician. Sandra was precise in a way that scientists tend to be, not dismissive of the unusual, but careful about the difference between what was observed and what was concluded. When she told me something, she was telling me what she saw, not what she decided it meant. She described an afternoon research trip she'd been part of about 4 years ago. A small crew, 2 researchers, including herself, running transects about 20 miles offshore from Cape Hatteras. Clear weather, calm conditions, work proceeding normally. Around 3 in the afternoon, the boat's hydrophone, the underwater microphone array they used to record ambient ocean sound and track marine mammals, began registering a sound that neither Sandra nor her colleague could identify. She described it carefully. Low frequency, rhythmic but not mechanical. It had the variation of something organic rather than the regularity of an engine or a pump. It rose and fell in a pattern that reminded her, she said, of breathing, though she was careful to note that the frequency was far too low for any air-breathing animal she was aware of. It lasted for approximately 25 minutes, during which time the boat remained in the area, attempting to localize the source. They never localized it. The sound seemed to come from below rather than from a direction, from depth rather than distance. When it stopped completely and did not return. Sandra's colleague, a marine mammal acoustician with 15 years of experience, reviewed the recording later and was unable to match it to any cataloged biological or mechanical sound source. The recording was submitted to the research institution's acoustic archive where it sits, labeled with its date and coordinates, unidentified. Sandra told me that in her years on the water she had heard a great many things that initially seemed inexplicable, and that most of them eventually turned out to have ordinary explanations. She was not, she said, a person who jumped to dramatic conclusions. But that sound, she said, was something breathing. I know what breathing sounds like. I've recorded thousands of hours of marine mammal respiration. Whatever was underneath us that afternoon was breathing, and it was doing it at a scale I don't have a reference for. She paused for a moment. The ocean covers most of this planet, she said. Most of it has never been adequately explored. People forget that. We have better maps of the surface of the moon than we have of the deep ocean floor. Whatever's down there, we've found a fraction of it. The rest is still in the dark. The ocean is honest. It has never promised us that we understand it. It has never offered the comfort of complete knowledge, and it has never adjusted itself to the limits of what we're able to comprehend. It was here for billions of years before the first human eyes looked out at it, and what lives in its depths has had all that time to become whatever it is without our awareness or our categorization. What we know about the ocean is a narrow strip of light at the edge of an almost incomprehensible darkness. The things that have been documented, cataloged, mapped, they represent the top of the water column and the accessible margins of the shelf. Below the thermocline, in the abyssal zones where light does not reach and pressure would reduce a human body to nothing in seconds, there are ecosystems we have barely sampled. Species discovered only as decomposed remains washed ashore. Sounds recorded but not sourced. Behaviors observed once and never again replicated. The man circling a fishing boat in the Gulf at 3 in the morning. The figure at the end of the wrong hallway on a cruise ship. The stranger breathing under a bed on a solo coastal voyage. Ray's voice on the dead radio channel. The 2 women watching something in the water that didn't look like it belonged here. The rope with 14 unknown knots. The breathing in the deep water at a scale Sandra Weeks didn't have a reference for. Some of these have explanations. Some of them are partially explained and partially open. Some of them have no explanation at all. What they share is the ocean. The honest place. The place that never promised it was safe, never suggested it was fully known, never offered the reassurance that everything living in its depth had already been found and named and understood. We sail out across it in our small boats, carrying our lights and our radios and our statistics about likelihood and safety, and we are, all of us, always, floating on the surface of something that goes down farther than we can follow. And in the dark, far from shore, something looks up.